In the last class we have learned market mechanism and we have seen what is the effect on equilibrium price and quantity if there is increase in demand, decrease in demand, increase in supply and decrease in supply. So today we will be learning about special cases. So under special cases we learn about perfectly elastic supply. Okay, where supply is perfectly elastic and if there is increase or decrease in demand, what is the effect on equilibrium price and quantity. Similarly, we will see perfectly inelastic supply. When supply is perfectly inelastic, what happens to equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity if there is increase or decrease in demand. So first let us see when supply is perfectly elastic. So what happens to equilibrium price and quantity if there is increase or decrease in demand. So you can see in this diagram, I have drawn a perfectly elastic supply curve. Okay, it is parallel to x-axis. Clear? Now if you don't know the concept of elasticity of supply, just go through the chapter elasticity of supply, then you see this video so that it will be clear to you. So you can see that it is I have drawn a perfectly supply curve which is parallel to x-axis. Now I have drawn a simple demand curve, that is D. So here I got equilibrium point where supply and demand is equal. So this is quantity. So now if I increase the demand, it shifts towards right. Now if there is increase in demand, that is D1 and D1 is your new demand curve when it is increased. So you can see that equilibrium point shifts towards right, that is E1, and you can see we got a increase in equilibrium quantity. Clear? And price remains constant. There is no change in price. Clear? So what happens when I increase the demand towards right? What happens? The equilibrium point shifts from E to E1 and there is increase in equilibrium quantity, that is from Q to Q1. Clear? Now similarly, if I decrease the demand, so if demand decreases, the demand curve shifts towards left. Now what happens? Our equilibrium point comes to E2, that it shifts towards left, and what happens to equilibrium quantity? It decreases to Q2, but price remains fixed. So this is the effect on equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity if there is increase in demand and decrease in demand and supply being perfectly elastic. Now let us see what happens if there is increase in demand and decrease in demand and supply is inelastic. Now we have already seen that when supply is perfectly elastic, if the demand increases and decreases, what is effect on equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now we will see if the supply is inelastic, what is the effect on equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity if there is increase and decrease in demand. Suppose if I draw a simple demand curve here, so it is normal price. Now if I increase the demand, so if I shift demand curve towards right, what happens? The equilibrium quantity remains constant and what happens? Price increases. So before the equilibrium point was here, now it comes to E dash. Clear? So when there is increase in demand, suppose the demand curve before was D, now when it is increased it becomes D dash. Now when there is increase in demand, what happens? Equilibrium quantity remains constant and what happens to equilibrium price? It increases from P to P1. Clear? Now if I decrease the demand, it shifts towards left. What happens? The equilibrium point shifts towards E2. Before it was in E1 when it was increasing. Now when it is decreasing, the equilibrium point shifts from E to E2. So what happens? Equilibrium quantity remains constant, but what happens? The equilibrium price decreases. Clear? So this was the effect of increase in demand and decrease in demand when supply is perfectly inelastic. Now let us see about demand. So students, now we have seen the effect on equilibrium price and quantity when supply was perfectly elastic and supply was inelastic. Now we will see in the case of demand. Now if the demand is perfectly elastic and demand is perfectly inelastic, what happens to equilibrium price and quantity when there is increase in supply and decrease in supply? So I have drawn in the diagram a supply curve and a perfectly elastic demand curve which is parallel to x-axis and price is P. So what happens if I increase? So okay, here it was equilibrium point E. Now if I increase the supply, what happens? It comes to rightward shift will be there. So if there is increase in supply, what happens? We get the equilibrium point E1 here, and this is your equilibrium quantity. So we can say that when supply curve increases from S to S dash or S1, so when there is increase in supply, what happens? Equilibrium point comes towards right and the equilibrium quantity increases and price remains constant. Clear? Now similarly, if I decrease the supply, so it comes towards left hand side, and you can see we get equilibrium point E2 and the equilibrium quantity, that's Q2, decreases and price remains constant. So this is your decreased supply curve, that's S2. So this way there is effect on equilibrium price and quantity when there is increase in supply and when there is decrease in supply. Now let us see one more effect, that is when demand is perfectly inelastic. What will happen if there is increase in supply and decrease in supply on equilibrium price and quantity? So now we'll see the case of perfectly inelastic demand. So you can see that I have drawn a perfectly inelastic demand which is parallel to y-axis, and I have drawn a supply curve. If there is increase in supply and decrease in supply, what will happen to equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price? So if I increase the supply, if I increase the supply, what happens? It shifts towards your right. So we get one equilibrium point, that is E1. So this is S1. So you can see that when I increase the supply from S to S1, so the equilibrium shifts towards downward. Clear? Or we say rightward. So what happens? Equilibrium quantity remains constant, but there is fall in price, that is from P to P1. Clear? But quantity remains, equilibrium quantity remains constant. Now if I decrease the supply, so it moves towards left. So what happens? You can see that we got one equilibrium point E2, and this is your supply curve. But what happens? Quantity remains same, but your equilibrium price, that is P2, increases. So this is the effect of increase in supply and decrease in supply when your demand is perfectly inelastic. So you can see that when the supply curve was increasing, quantity remained same, but your price fall from P to P1 and equilibrium point shifts from E to E1. But when supply was decreased, so when it was moved to left hand side, what happens? We got one equilibrium point E2 and our equilibrium price increased, but our equilibrium quantity remains fixed. So today I have taught you the special case, that is about perfectly elastic supply, perfectly inelastic supply, perfectly elastic demand and perfectly inelastic demand.